This is the Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life.
Imagine this. The entire American system of presidential succession just stops. It grinds to a halt. And not because of some huge national crisis, but because of a tiny piece of cardboard, a fragment called a chad.
And because of just a few hundred votes in one state.
Exactly. Welcome to our deep dive into Bush v. Gore.
This was so much more than a legal case. I mean, this was probably the most intense, high-stakes moment in modern American politics, where the selection of the 43rd president came down entirely to how courts would interpret these ballots in Florida.
The stakes were, well, they were just visceral. On election night 2000, George W. Bush has this incredibly narrow lead over Al Gore in Florida.
So narrow that it automatically triggers a machine recount under state law. Less than 0.5%.
But the real mission of this deep dive, the question we want to answer, is why the U.S. Supreme Court eventually stepped in and just stopped all the counting.
And our sources show it really boiled down to one central tension. How do you balance one goal finding of voters' true intent with a completely different constitutional rule that says all votes have to be treated equally?
And that leads us to the core takeaway. If you remember one thing from this, it should be this. The Supreme Court stopped the Florida recount because different counties were counting votes with completely different rules.
Right. And that, the court said, violates the constitutional need for, uniform and non-arbitrary standards in an election.
Yeah.
That lack of uniformity was the deal breaker.
So let's start with the story. How did we get there?
Well, the narrative really begins in chaos.
Right after the election.
Exactly. The automatic machine recount happens, but the result is still razor thin. So the Gore campaign starts focusing on these thousands of ballots that the machines couldn't read.
The ones they kicked out.
They argue that the machines just missed the voters' real intentions. So they push for manual recounts by hand in a few specific big counties, places like Palm Beach, Miami-Dade.
Ah, the famous undervotes.
The undervotes, yes.
Yeah.
Ballots where the machine didn't see a clear punch for president. The Gore team's argument was, look, if a person just looks at this ballot, they can figure out what the voter meant, even if a machine can't.
Which, that immediately raises a huge question of fairness, right? Because if counting is based on interpretation, well, that's a subjective thing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's the pivot point for this entire case. And it escalated fast. The Florida Supreme Court got involved, and on December 8th, they ordered manual recounts to start right away in several counties.
They didn't just order it, they got specific, didn't they?
Oh, very specific. They directed that 9,000 undervotes in Miami-Dade had to be recounted by hand. They were actively telling officials to add these new interpreted totals back into the official statewide count.
Wait, hold on. So in just a few days, a state court is creating new counting procedures on the fly and changing the certified vote total for a presidential election.
It was an incredible rush, a real whirlwind. And that's the moment the U.S. Supreme Court becomes the final decider. Bush and Cheney's legal team filed an emergency stay request.
They basically asked the federal courts to hit the pause button.
And the court did. Almost immediately. On December 9th, they granted the stay. The sheer speed of that tells you how serious they thought this was. By taking the case, the whole thing shifted from a state-level dispute to a major federal constitutional review.
Okay, so once it's at the federal level, what are the big legal questions they're looking at?
There were two massive constitutional hurdles. The first was about fairness. Did the Florida court's order, with its, lack of consistent standards, violate the equal protection and due process clauses of the Constitution?
And the second?
The second was all about time. Did this whole recount mess comply with a critical federal deadline called the safe harbor deadline?
Okay, let's unpack equal protection first. For those of us who aren't lawyers, what does the right to vote on equal terms actually mean in a situation like this?
It's actually a pretty simple concept at its core. Once a state decides to grant its citizens the right to vote, it has to make sure the conditions for exercising that right are the same for everyone.
Everywhere in the state.
Everywhere. The court reasoned that if the rules for what counts as a valid ballot are different in Miami-Dade than they are in Palm Beach, well, then you're giving one person's vote more weight than another's.
Can you give a concrete example of that? How is a voter's ballot in one county actually being treated differently?
This is where we get to the chads, the little pieces of paper. So imagine a canvassing board is looking at a ballot with an imperfect punch.
Okay.
In one county, they might decide that a dimpled chad where there's just an indentation but no hole, clearly shows the voter's intent. So they count it.
But the next county over might have a different rule.
Exactly. The neighboring county might say, no, we need a hanging chad where it's punched through on at least 2 corners to count it.
So the exact same ballot would be counted in one place and thrown out in another.
And that's the violation, that arbitrary difference. The process wasn't fair because the rules weren't the same for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. A single grading route was for the whole state. Okay, so let's move to that other huge problem, the time pressure. What was this December 12th safe harbor deadline? Why was it such a brick wall?
So this deadline comes from a federal law, and its whole purpose is to create finality, to make sure presidential elections actually end. The Constitution says Congress has to count the electoral votes in January.
Right.
To avoid total chaos, this law created a safe harbor. It says if a state settles all of its election disputes and certifies its electors by a specific date in 2000, that was December 12th, then Congress has to accept that result. No questions asked.
It's conclusive.
It's conclusive. But if Florida missed that deadline, the state risked having Congress itself decide which slate of electors to accept, Bush's or Gore's.
Wow, that would have been a constitutional crisis on a whole other level.
A catastrophe. It would have moved the fight from the courts straight into the U.S. Congress with no clear way to resolve it.
So the Supreme Court wasn't just looking at how the votes were being counted. They were looking at the clock and realizing there just wasn't enough time to do it fairly.
That was the conclusion, yes. They decided that you couldn't possibly create and implement a fair, uniform, statewide manual recount in the, 4 days that were left before that deadline. The Florida court's order just didn't provide the time or the structure to do it right.
So let's get into the majority's core reasoning. Why specifically did they reverse the Florida Supreme Court? What were the fatal flaws?
Well, the fundamental problem, as we said, was the total lack of uniform standards. The court pointed to a few things. First, the standards themselves were all over the place.
Changing from county to county.
And even within counties.
Yeah.
Second, the scope of the recount was inconsistent. Some counties were looking at all their ballots, but others were only looking at the undervotes.
So different ballots were getting different levels of scrutiny across the state?
Yes. And the most damning thing was just how arbitrary the rules were for figuring out that very subjective idea of voter intent. When that kind of interpretation changes based on geography, the court said that's arbitrary and disparate treatment. The whole thing lacked the basic rudimentary safeguards you need for a fair election.
They also talked about the practical problems too, didn't they? Like, who would even oversee this thing? How could you ensure fairness under such a tight deadline?
Absolutely. The majority concluded that given the time crunch of that safe harbor deadline, the plan from the Florida Supreme Court was simply unworkable and unconstitutional. So they reversed the judgment.
Now, we have to talk about how controversial this decision was, and still is. It was a per curiam decision, which is unusual. What does that mean?
A per curiam decision means by the court. It's an opinion that isn't signed by any individual justice. It's often used in urgent cases or politically sensitive ones to present a single institutional voice.
Even though we know the court was deeply split, 5-4.
Deeply split. It was meant to project a sense of finality and resolve the crisis, but the dissents were pretty fiery.
And people still argue that this was a political decision, that the federal court overstepped its bounds. What was the main argument from the dissenting justices?
The dissenters, Justices Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer, their core argument was that the majority was interfering in what should have been a state issue. Justice Stevens wrote that the Florida court was just doing its job, interpreting Florida's own election laws.
What did they say about the equal protection problem? Did they just ignore the lack of uniformity?
Not entirely.
Sure.
Some, like Justice Breyer, actually agreed that the lack of a uniform standard was a constitutional problem. But, and this is the key difference, he argued the solution wasn't to stop the count.
So what was the solution, in his view?
He argued the Supreme Court should have sent the case back to Florida and ordered them to create a uniform standard and then continue the count under that new fair rule. So the disagreement was really about the remedy.
But the majority said there just wasn't time for that remedy.
Exactly. The majority's view was that time had run out to fix the problem constitutionally. And that's really the holding of the case. The Florida recount plan failed the equal protection test, and there wasn't enough time before the federal deadline to create a new plan that would pass. So the recount had to stop.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. Why are we still talking about this case more than 2 decades later? What is its lasting impact today?
Well, it's foundational because it established that this federal guarantee of equality applies directly to the nuts and bolts of how presidential elections are run at the state level. It set a clear precedent that procedures have to be consistent for everyone.
And it led to real tangible changes, didn't it? I mean, this was a huge wake-up call about how bad our voting systems were.
A massive one. The whole mess with the Chads led directly to Congress passing the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, in 2002. That law sent federal money to states to upgrade their voting machines and get rid of those old punch card systems.
It also drew some new lines around the power of the courts, right?
Yes. It highlighted that constant tension between the role of a state legislature, which writes the election rules, and the role of the state court, which interprets them, especially when a federal deadline is looming.
It really feels like the court prioritized finality and uniform process over everything else.
I think that's fair to say. They prioritized the need for a stable final outcome. And the only way to get there, in their view, was to ensure the process was constitutionally uniform for every single voter.
So at the end of the day, this wasn't really about picking a winner. It was about whether the process being used to find that winner was fair and equal for every single person in Florida.
Right. Bush v. Gore forced this major confrontation. When that subjective search for a voter's intent crashes into the constitutional requirement for equal treatment, the court said that when the clock is ticking, equal treatment has to win.
So the outcome obviously determined a presidency, but the legal rule it left behind is about your right as a voter to have your ballot counted under the exact same rules as everyone else in your state. And that leaves us with a really important question for the future, doesn't it?
It does.
In our next course election, when new technology creates some new kind of ambiguous ballot, how far can a state go to figure out the true intent of its voters before that very human subjective effort violates the guarantee of equal protection we're all entitled to? That tension is the real legacy of 2000.
You've been listening to The Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with the next case.